One of the things that our charity is about is supporting people through their cancer journey. And one of the ways that cancer affects us incredibly is when somebody dies, and it can be one of the most painful, disorientating, lonely, intense periods of our life. So we want to do a series of short videos just to support you through that grief and help you to understand what's going on when you're actually starting to grieve for somebody. And a really useful tool is something that we call the Whirlpool of Grief, and we'll show you a picture of the Whirlpool of Grief, but actually talk about it. When somebody experiences a life-threatening or a life-limiting illness, our whole life turns upside down. And if we actually go to the picture, you can see that we're on the river of life and we're going quite happily along, maybe rowing in our little rowing boat, and suddenly we get the experience of a life-limiting illness, and suddenly it feels like we're very, very alone. And at times we'll start trying to row against the tide. We don't want it to happen. We know that something serious is happening. We know that we're going to lose somebody that we love. And yet we desperately don't want it to happen. And I think in that process there's a moment of exquisite pain. And that moment is that we know what's happening. We don't want them to suffer, but actually we don't want them to die either, because that means they'll be gone forever. And that place of exquisite pain just breaks us open into a place of extreme pain and extreme sadness. When somebody actually dies, then it's like falling off a cliff. We've never experienced the pain like it. And if you actually imagine the water cascading down from a waterfall into a whirlpool of grief, a whirlpool of emotion, a whirlpool of feelings. And what sort of things do we feel in that whirlpool? Some of the water will fall onto rocks, and that's for incredible pain, sometimes physical pain that we might feel. We can't go on, our life is changed forever. Some of the water will fall onto the side of the pool and it will churn around. And what are some of the emotions that come up when we actually feel those? When somebody first dies, there can be the shock. Have they really died? They can't have died. How can this be happening to me? And sometimes a numbness and a denial of what's happened. I remember one person that used to set the table for two, even though she knew intellectually and in her head that her husband had died, but emotionally she couldn't accept it. So the denial was that if I lay that place at the table, it won't have happened. And the reality that actually he wasn't going to join her at the table was devastating. And sometimes we become numb because that helps to protect us from the reality of the feelings that we have of that sadness. In that emotion of the whirlpool, all our emotions are all over the place. There can be a loss that comes through so much, but actually we're emotionally disorganized. We don't know where to start, we don't know what to do. There's so many practical things we've got to do when somebody dies, but also there's our sense of identity. Who are we now when our husband, our wife, that person we love has died? So some of the emotions that go with that, we can feel apathy. We don't even want to get out of bed in the morning. Intense pain, as we've just said. We can actually yearn for that person. We want them back there. If only things would be different. If I go to sleep tonight and I wake up, maybe it won't have happened. And then that dull ache in our stomach, or that grip of fear in our stomach as we wake up and realise actually that person has died. There's lots of official stuff to do, but it's the emotional stuff which is the one that holds us back. We might feel completely defeated. Love will be mixed up with sadness. Guilt might come that we didn't say the right thing, we didn't support them enough. If only we'd have picked up things earlier and gone to the doctor early, maybe things would be different. And then the realisation that things aren't different because they've actually died. So in that whirlpool of grief is an intensity of emotions, but sometimes those emotions we push to the sides of the whirlpool so they can ripple. If you throw a stone into the water, it has a ripple effect, and so grief has an effect on all of our life. In every situation, relationships, in every single aspect of our life is affected. And it's how we start to recognise that. And sometimes just by recognising it and actually saying, yes, that's how it was, it helps us to feel like we're not going mad. Sometimes we feel like we're going mad. We don't know quite what to think or feel. everything has changed in a moment. We're the same person, you're the same person before that person died, you're the same person afterwards, but actually it doesn't feel like that. It feels like we don't know ourselves anymore because of the emotions that we're actually feeling. With time, those emotions will abate, they will change. One person described grief as a 100-foot wave hitting us and knocking us flat, and as soon as we stand up, suddenly that wave of grief hits us again. And that can be in the most extraordinary circumstances. We might just get up in the morning, go for a walk, and suddenly we feel like we can't put one foot in front of the other because of the emotion we're feeling. When we stand up, that wave of grief hits us. It might be listening to a song on the radio, it might be visiting a place that we've visited with that person who has died, and suddenly that rush of emotion comes back. With time, those waves become slightly less, but on anniversaries or on birthdays or significant occasions that we remember the person who's died, it might feel that it's just happening all over again, and that rawness. Sometimes hear that expression, don't we, that sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. Sometimes it's 1 step forward and 17 steps back. And other times you can actually start to think, actually today's been okay. And then we can feel guilty for that today is okay, because actually we miss them every minute of every day. And it's understanding that's okay, that's part of our grieving process, that we're trying to come to terms with something that doesn't make sense. How can somebody be there 1 minute and not the next? And our grief is total again. With time, we can start to move through from that waterfall almost into the flowing river. If you imagine that waterfall, it's churning up that whirlpool, but eventually it forms into a river, and that river becomes calm again. But at different times, we can be sucked back into the middle of that whirlpool again. Eventually we'll start to make more sense of it, and as our grieving we become more accustomed to it, more used to our grief, we'll start to understand ourselves a little better and our reaction to missing that person that we love. We'll start to make excursions out, we'll start to talk to people, we'll start to, almost in this time of pandemic, we'll ease the lockdown that grief puts on us, we'll start to explore again, we'll start to go out, we'll start to feel our way into normal life again. But in the beginning it doesn't feel like normal life, because our life has changed in such a devastating way. So we start to reorganise our life, we start to miss them. And one of the paradoxes, I think, of grief and bereavement is that for a while it's so painful that we've lost that person that we love, that we can't find them. Our memories are too painful to think about, so you'll hear people saying, I keep myself busy because when I'm busy I don't think about it. But there comes a time, grief is a stalker, it will follow us, it will track us, and then when we're least expecting it, it'll jump on us and we'll end up a jelly mess, like it's all happened all over again. So sometimes sitting with something allows something else to break through, and sitting with the pain is one of the most uncomfortable things that we could possibly do. But sometimes sitting with our grief, remembering, even though it's too painful, sometimes that love that we've shared, that unconditional love, that relationship that we've had with that person can start to touch us and actually start to heal us. And I think that moment is that we start to find that person again, when we start to think, oh, do you remember when so and so did that? Oh, I really miss them because they would have done this. We start to incorporate them, we start to bring them back into our life, whereas in the beginning it's too painful. But with time we can start to treasure those memories, and I think that's a really important thing to realise. But that will take time, and one of the biggest things, often when I'm with somebody and sitting aside somebody who's been bereaved, is be gentle with yourselves. Your life has changed, don't force things, it's not going to get better overnight. So some of the feelings in this whirlpool of grief that we might experience, that we search for the person who've died, we know that's irrational because we know that they've died, but we search for them. It might be you're walking in the street and you see somebody in the distance and you think, and then in that moment you go through the process of grief again, that they're not there, they can't be there because they've died. The pain, as we've talked about, is intense. We might be angry, and underneath anger often is fear. We're fearful of the future, but we might become really angry with our family because they don't understand, or they're not visiting us enough, and then they might visit us and then we don't want them there. So sometimes what can be right one day won't be right the next. Sometimes the inability to trust, we're grieving, we're trying to come to terms with something which is so hard for us in our lives. Sleep, why go to sleep? Sleeplessness will come and we will spend ages and ages in the middle of the night going over and over things that could have been different, could I have done things differently. Sometimes we'll get involved in a crusade, we'll have something that we want to do in their memory, which can be fantastic because it can give us energy to do stuff, to raise money for charity, to do a sponsored walk. That could be really important. What I think a lot of people find is that we relive what's happened, and that intensity of the last weeks or days, we actually relive and we keep playing it over and over again in our mind. What could be really helpful then is if we write it out. Sometimes writing it out and just ripping it up and putting it in the bin can be incredibly helpful. Sometimes we lack confidence. We actually find the ability to go out is really, really hard because we've lost our confidence, we've lost our other half, and we're imbalanced because we don't know how to be on our own because we've always done things as a couple. A deep depression, sometimes it's not depression, it's a deep sadness. We've lost the person that we love and we've got to take time to come to terms with that. So a deep sadness is part and parcel of what we experience in our grieving process. And I think one of the most important things that we experience is love, is that deep love for the person that we've lost, for the person who's died. And that can be incredibly painful to think about because we know we're not going to experience that love in the same way. But with time, we'll start to understand just how much that love has touched our life. And our lives won't be the same again, but that love we can actually carry inside us into the future. So with the whirlpool of grief, I think when we come out into that level, sort of gentler place where it's not churning around quite as much, we start to accept the reality of their absence. And that's really hard, but we can start to move forward a little bit. Really interesting, I think, as we move out of that whirlpool of grief, sometimes we want to move on. And I think that's quite hard for a bereaved person to hear. And I often wonder if it's the wrong expression, because moving on often means that we leave something behind. I think when we've experienced a death, we actually move forward and we carry that person with us, that experience of love, that experience of life that we've shared with them. We move forward into the future, which can be a great future. It can be a future which is full of new love, of promise, of joy when we do new things and creative things, but always there'll be that little bit of sadness that they're not there to share it with us. So I think that expression sometimes, isn't it, that grief is something that we never get over, which sounds really daunting, but I think it's something we learn to live with and we walk hand in hand, and it doesn't have to be that fierce emotional storm that we have, that whirlpool of grief in the beginning. Sometimes it can become gentler as time goes on.